Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I mean, I don't live too far from here. It's my first time on campus. So it's a real treat for me, and I appreciate it. So my remarks today are based in part on my latest book, A Virtue of Color-Blindness, in addition to some of my public-facing writings. So what I try to do is to bring together the concept of character, of virtue, and tie it in with the way that we talk about identity politics and American national identity. I try to combine the two. I do that in the second half. The first half, I get into the weeds a bit in terms of Greek philosophy. So if you can bear with me, I don't get too into the weeds, but just a tad bit, and then I broaden the discussion. Okay. So the title of my remarks is The Virtue of Color-Blindness in the Classics. And let me tell you a little bit about myself. So as an undergraduate, I was introduced to the field of classics by a professor named Bill Hervey. He was African American. His specialty was political philosophy, and he took an interest in my academic development as an undergraduate. Bill loved all things ancient Greek, especially Plato and Aristotle, which is what I specialize in. But it's the passion that he brought to classics. The passion, I mean, it was just amazing just to watch him teach the classics. I mean, he was possessed. But he also had a degree of sophrosune. If you've heard of sophrosune, it just means moderation, sort of order. So he brought a sense of all of that to the ancient Greeks that really lit a fire in me. And so, but most importantly, he taught me that the classical knowledge found in the works of ancient Greek political philosophy was the very embodiment of a liberal arts education. Bill would say, classical knowledge, quote, makes us free by separating us from particulars of race, of class, of gender, of time and place, and of necessity. Real freedom is intellectual freedom. That's always talked to me, resonated with me. So as you can see, learning to appreciate the tradition out of which the liberal arts were developed and out of which Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle emerged, I was learning to appreciate a type of education, the classical education. To me, this type of education proved to be superior and remains superior compared to its competitors in the field of education. Now, it's significant that the classical tradition was introduced to me by an African American. So why is it significant? Because some Black Americans and their well-placed allies have mounted, I think, the fiercest and most effective attack against the value and relevance of classical education. Due to our racialized past, Americans have been receptive to these attacks. And of course, there are others who despise the Western intellectual tradition, but not have been as effective as the attacks in the name of racial justice. But those attacks on the classical tradition in the name of racial justice are misplaced. Why? Because the classical tradition, the ancient Greek philosophical tradition, is the real ally, the most consistent ally of racial justice. Excuse me, I have allergies. So let me explain. Let me explain why the classical tradition is an ally, in fact, of racial justice. So when Martin Luther King spoke in 1963 during his March in Washington, he famously said in his I Have a Dream speech that he dreamed that his 4 children would one day live in a nation where they would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And earlier the same year, and in a radically different context, King's letter from the Birmingham jail spoke powerfully about the collateral damage of racial prejudice done to Black Americans and white Americans, and done to those, quote, great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the founding fathers in their formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. End quote. No other public figure in modern times has expressed sentiments so resonant with the colorblind tradition and the Western intellectual tradition. Given King's moral and practical advocacy he seems to have understood that he was a mere vessel of ethical thought that privileged individual character, ethos, and its choices and actions over conventional and arbitrary markers of distinction, such as a person's race or sex. So the colorblind approach to race relations that I'm advocating is grounded on the moral belief that the mere possession of hereditary qualities like race should not confer moral merit by their possession or non-possession. Instead, moral merit can be and should be conferred upon an individual's actions because actions reveal character. So when I speak about character, I should be understood as speaking about the right desires, feelings, pleasures, and pains that make up the states of the virtuous character. So the belief in character, as opposed to ascriptive qualities, as the locus of moral agency, has a rich and comprehensive history in the West, and it continues to animate our own founding documents and way of life. So in order to see just how significant prioritizing character over ascriptive qualities has been in the West, we must begin with some of the first recorded ethical reflections on the moral importance of character, which began, of course, with the ancient Greek ethical tradition known as eudaimonism. Now, there are different versions of eudaimonism, but the one I'm focusing on is the one initiated by Plato and Aristotle. So, as an ethical framework initiated by Plato and Aristotle, eudaimonism assumes that the ultimate human good is happiness, and the task of ethics is to figure out what exactly happiness is and what contributes and constitutes happiness. Accordingly, ancient Greek ethics is person-centered, which means that in thinking about the best way to live or what to do, the ancient Greeks focused on two things: determining the right thing to do and doing it properly, motivated by one's virtuous character. Although bad people can certainly do good actions, they cannot do actions as the good person would do them, which is to say, properly motivated. Properly motivated actions are anchored in and generated by one's virtuous character, which is the end result of a person's autonomous choices. Character is not the product of factors that fall outside of the sphere of choice, voluntary action, and how choice is exercised morally. Likewise, the body and what belongs to it are not involved with the manifestation of virtue. Thus, for the ancient Greeks, descriptive qualities like race played no role in the formation of character nor the assessment of character. So the virtuous character comes about by habit or practice. Virtue is a disposition that an individual displays through the motivation to act in an appropriate way and to the appropriate extent in the right circumstances. Habit and the development of habits is crucial for moral education. So the formation of character, and most crucially for moral motivation. So in the same way that we learn arts or sports by doing them, so we become morally good by performing moral actions, by engaging in moral behavior. So doing courageous deeds makes us courageous people. The person having the virtue courage tends to do courageous kinds of actions courageously. So virtue is a way to secure both the orientation towards the right thing to do, but also the doing of them through proper motivation. So in short, the ancient Greeks, most notably Plato and Aristotle, relied on the formation of character to secure good actions properly motivated. A passage in Plato's dialogue is a good illustration of the emphasis that the ancient Greeks placed on character as opposed to ascriptive qualities like race. So the context is the following. It's a conversation in the dialogue. It's cautionary and ironic because Socrates is defending himself during his trial. He is being accused of a number of different things, one of which is the claim that he corrupts the youth. In the passage, Socrates admonishes the Athenians for prioritizing conventional and bodily goods over the good of the soul, namely the the virtuous character. Quote, then, if one of you disputes this and says he does care about wisdom, truth, and virtue, I shall not let him go at once or leave him, but I shall question him. Examine him and test him if I do not think he has attained the goodness that he says he has. I shall reproach him because he attaches little importance to the most important things and greater importance to the inferior things. I shall treat in this way anyone I happen to meet, young and old, citizens and stranger, and more so the citizens because you are more kindred to me. Be sure that this is what the God orders me to do, and I think there is no greater blessings for the city than my service to the God, for I go around doing nothing but persuading both young and old among you not to care for your body or your wealth in preference to, or as strongly as, for the best possible state of your soul, the virtuous character. Input. So the emphasis here is the contrast between appearing to care for the proper type of goods and actually caring for those goods as expressed through one's commitment and character. So the most important things that Socrates mentions are those things that fall outside of the body and what belongs to it. These things are truth, wisdom, and virtue. And they enable one to properly use the body and what belongs to it, as well as external goods, money, friends. Ascriptive qualities like race fall into the class of things that pertain to the body and what belongs to it. So, in a modern context, another way of stating Socrates' overall point is to say that the content of one's character determines one's attitude towards the body and what belongs to it, like race, and external goods, like money and friendship. This brings me back to the color-blind sentiments expressed by Martin Luther King. So he tapped into the rich Western philosophical tradition initiated by the Greeks. Why did he do that? To gain much needed support during the Civil Rights Movement from a broad swath of Americans who knew that racism was wrong. Socrates' message that character counts resonated with the deep sense of dignity he had among good, decent Americans. Aristotle is the other foundational figure in the person-centered eudaimonistic framework. Whereas Plato's apology focuses on the role of virtue, the proper use and perspective towards ascriptive qualities of the body and what belongs to it, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics illustrates the role choice plays in the conferring of moral merit upon action. So here too, like Plato, Aristotle argues that the type of choices one makes is anchored in one's character, certainly not in the body and its physical qualities. So there's a world of difference between a mercenary soldier fighting courageously to protect a foreign land versus a homegrown patriot fighting courageously to protect his own country's land. So the patriot's action exhibits the proper type of courage in the appropriate circumstances, properly motivated. Accordingly, moral merit can be conferred upon the patriot's type of courage. The mercenary's actions do not exhibit true courage at all because his apparent courage is perverted by ulterior motives that prevent the proper type of courageous motivation. Aristotle's comments on the importance of choice, voluntary action, as a reflection of character are as follows. Quote, still they, the ignorant themselves, by their slack lives, are responsible for becoming men of that kind. And men are themselves responsible for being unjust or self-indulgent, and that they cheat or spend their time in drinking bouts and the like. For it is activities exercised on particular objects that make the corresponding character. So what you do is what you become. This is plain for the case of people training for any contest or action. They practice the activity the whole time. Now, not to know that it is from the exercise of activities on a particular object that states the character produced is the mark of a thoroughly senseless person. Inquiry. So character can be morally praised or condemned because it results from our prior choices and actions. And our prior choices and actions were voluntary. So we are responsible for our own characters in the present, and it makes no sense to praise, condemn, or assign moral status to ascriptive qualities like race, because one's race is indelible. It's an indelible feature of one's body, and it has not come about through choice. So when society does assign moral status to race, as Dr. King illustrates, bitterness and hatred become the main currency through which Americans interact with one another. And the reason for the antipathy has everything to do with the arbitrariness of assigning moral status to racial characteristics. So when character becomes the main currency through which Americans interact with one another, the relations become less stilted, more fluid, and natural. Okay, so this brings us to the present day. So keeping in mind what I just argued, what's the relationship between virtue, character, and DEI, identity politics? So when we look at the ancient philosophical tradition, the Western intellectual tradition, fair play in judging others by the content of their character is an abiding theme. But today, we're witnessing something positive, the demise of DEI. And it started, in part, with the Supreme Court's ruling in 2023 against race-conscious admission policy, so Student for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. And so now we have the opportunity to reaffirm the importance of virtue, character, and color-blindness as it relates to America's national identity. Now, the demise of DEI isn't an unconditional good if we, as Americans, fail to consider one of the most important questions facing us today. What should replace DEI? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. So without hyperbole, we can say that the answer to this question will determine the trajectory of our domestic politics. And I think you're starting to see some of that today. What should replace it? As the saying goes, nature abhors a vacuum. For many Americans, DEI and its identity politics filled a void. But that void must be replaced by a positive American narrative that goes beyond creedalism. I'll talk about creedalism in a second, but creedalism is not enough to fill the void, and I'll explain why. So we need something that goes beyond creedalism and is grounded in a set of ideas and practices that are more substantial and enduring than what DEI offers. If we're unable to construct a narrative and promote practices robust enough to provide a degree of unity amid the competing identities currently vying for recognition in the public square, we'll end up in a much worse place than where we were during the heyday of DEI's divisive practices. So the void that DEI filled is both ideological and existential. Identity politics is not simply ideological identities in racial, cultural, or sexual disguise. It's also a response to the same market forces and cultural forces that have fragmented and uprooted nearly all traditional communities and institutions in America. Family, faith communities, and ethnic communities. So the overriding question, ironically, of those who embrace identity politics seems to be, who am I? The question isn't simply one's personal reflection. Rather, it gives voice to a longing for, as the late sociologist Robert Nisbet titled one of his books, A Quest for Community. It's a longing for community, in part. So the question demands that one's assumed identity be recognized and have juridical standing, right? It's the politics of recognition. That's what identity politics is. So can you recognize me in law? And that's what makes it so divisive. This is college campuses are filled with this type of corrosive identity politics. Recognizing, seeing. America's ethnically diverse population and the alienation that some of its members express through oppositional identities would be well served, however, by what a positive American narrative and its cultural practices would offer. Which gets me to creedalism. Why is it ineffective against identity politics? So it's no longer enough to appeal to an American creedal identity in the way Martin Luther King Jr. did and the civil rights movement did. In the 21st century, creedalism alone has been especially ineffective at keeping identity politics at bay in American life. But creedalism is only one part of the American identity, albeit a very important part. The other part is cultural. Of course, these two aspects of the American identity are not mutually exclusive. The creedalist argument is captured, of course, eloquently by Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address. So his new birth of freedom was a call to Americans to ground their collective identity in substantive ideas such as constitutionalism, the rule of law, and human equality. All of which by itself amounts to a creedal or a notional definition of citizenship. That's not enough to unite Americans. I think it resonates. Lincoln also said in 1861, his first inaugural address, there are these mystic chords of memory. So he appeals to the very real sentiments that unite Americans as Americans, North and South. The sacrifice made by the founders, he reminds us, should be a source of strength and comfort to a beleaguered nation during a time of a political disruption and national identity crisis. Which is to say, the principles and way of life animated by the spirit of 1776 is both felt and believed. So today, we are undergoing a similar period of national identity crisis and need similar chords of memory to unite us as Americans. The formation of an American national identity does not begin with creedal or notional ideas. It begins in a particular geographic location, among a particular culture, and among a particular people, a core. Yes, America has a core. The author, David Hackett Fisher, in his book, Albion Seed, convincingly shows that the American identity was formed from a core of English-speaking settlers across the eastern United States from 1629 to 1775. These immigrants and their British folkways account for the various regional cultures that endure today. Taken as a whole, it was these British cultures that Publius, John Jay, seems to have in mind in Federalist number 2 when he wrote that, quote, Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs. Now, of course, Americans no longer have a common ancestry, but we certainly have a common Judeo-Christian culture that goes beyond mere ideas. America consists of a core culture animated by ideas and communicated through the English language. It has a civic and national and cultural identity. The overriding feature of that core American identity is Anglo-Protestant, the Anglo-Protestant disposition. What does that mean? Well, individualism, not excessive, not expressive, moral reform, religiosity, and a robust work ethic. The promotion of this core culture and its values and beliefs amounts to a robust American identity. Such an identity steers clear of an American racial identity, and it steers clear of a feeble, creedal, notional identity, or civic American identity. Embracing an American identity of what I'm proposing does give as the political scientist Samuel Goldman puts it, constitutive status to Anglo-Protestant culture. But my argument is different. I'm not saying we give privileged status to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? So we can separate culture, Anglo-Protestant culture, from ethnicity. And that's precisely what I think we need to do to acknowledge the core. It's done a lot of good. It promotes moral reform. Think about slavery, how far we've come. And so we have to keep that in mind as we think about what should replace DEI. But we have to acknowledge that we have a core, which some people have a problem with that. So in other words, creedalism coupled with specific cultural practices define America and what it means to be an American. The particularities, the preferences, the ascriptive qualities of one's identity are secondary, or should be secondary, if we are to take the American identity seriously. The creedalist's conception in isolation grounds the American identity solely in propositional or notional ideas. So again, constitutionalism, rule of law, and human equality. But it's deficient. So creedalism without a cultural component is especially ineffective against racial identity politics. So what do I have in mind? So when I speak about this cultural component, there are certain practices that we can make concrete that core that I've been speaking about. And so there are two proposals that I'll lay out. And each of those proposals, I argue, are instrumental in terms of shoring up that core culture, America's core identity. So the first, let's make English the official language of the United States. Let's also implement some version of a national service program nationwide. And I'll explain both. We'll flesh out both. Now, each of these practices would be enacted at the federal level by Congress, not through executive order. And you can imagine why that's the case. So neither of these practices are foreign to American soil. In 1780, John Adams proposed that English be made the official language of the United States. But for various reasons, the proposal was rejected. But since then, there have been several unsuccessful federal attempts to elevate the status of the English language in America. Various states have English as the official language. Colorado is one. But it has to be done at the federal level. Symbolically, etc. I'll say a bit more about that in a second. America is in a radically different place today from where it was in the past. And change in this area, making English the official language at the federal level, is needed to confront the present. Demographically, making English our official language would, at a minimum, complement the argument that we're not a nation of immigrants, but rather a settler nation. More importantly, elevating the status of the English language on the federal level would play an important symbolic role by serving as a proxy for many of the unifying core cultural features that we as Americans have rallied around historically and have employed to great effect during difficult times like the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. So the legacies of Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King testify to the power of the English language and the democratic culture it embodies. Secondly, implementing a national service program based on the core cultural features I've mentioned would contribute to the formation, hopefully, of a national American identity. The program would be directed mainly toward young adults and would be modeled on the integrated procedures currently used by the armed services to instill a sense of esprit de corps and belonging among enlistees. Aside from our all-volunteer military force, there are very few places or institutions where young adults socialize with those who are of a different social or race or from a different region for themselves. And when young adults do come in contact with one another, it is often on a college campus with other middle and upper middle class students. A national service program would hopefully motivate Americans to think more sympathetically about their fellow citizens when sorting themselves along the lines of class, race, region, or other subnational identities. So in addition to the two proposals that I lay out, we also need a narrative, a broad American national narrative, one that minimizes particular identities, subnational identities. We need a compelling American narrative in the public square that's more effective at promoting integration and rootedness. This is the only way to counteract the ever-proliferating anti-American ideas that are tearing us apart, especially in our institutions of higher education. Narratives are supposed to glue people together, right? So new immigrants to America, for example, exchange their old narratives and identities that once defined them in their old countries for a new American identity and narrative. That's what's supposed to happen. But except for learning a few facts about American history and how the government functions, it's not clear at all today what narrative or narratives new immigrants to America adopt. Given the feeble patriotism expressed by America's young, I'm doubtful that whatever narrative new immigrants to America adopt is compelling enough to win their complete allegiance over the long term. But that more positive American narrative would tell a story about the role that faith, family, and tradition have played and continue to play in the evolution of the country, both politically and culturally. That story would celebrate what were once widely agreed upon cultural precepts of upward mobility, that you should, for example, speak English competently, finish high school, complete college, get married before having children, and respect the laws. So, in conclusion, that unique American narrative that I'm proposing, and the story that it would tell, should be top of mind as we sort of contemplate and figure out what should replace DEI. No other narrative, especially weird racial narratives, is equipped to address the psychological and existential needs of alienation among a sizable group of Americans. So as we witness the gradual decline of the DEI regime, I think we can take solace in knowing what should take its place, if you agree. Thank you.
About 15-20 minutes for questions and answers. Please stand, identify yourself before you ask your question, and make sure your question is a question.
As opposed to
a speech, yeah, a rant. Yeah, I'm David Rainbow. I teach history here. Thanks for your talk.
Sure.
I find it very compelling to kind of critique the creedal approach and its inadequacies. The question has to do with what gives you confidence that language would prove a sufficient kind of remedy to the inadequacies of creedalism. And I'm thinking in particular, of course, there's a long history of language being central to cultural identity. So that makes sense to me, but that was in an era where language was regionally particular and could be used as a proxy for other cultural markers. My understanding is there are more English speakers in the world today outside of the Anglo-American sphere than there are inside the Anglo-American sphere. So given that, why would English, in your view, be sufficient to tie a national identity together?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that maybe it has passed its time. But when I say English, and I say that we should nationalize it, it should become official at the federal level, I'm talking about the proxies. What does English represent? So when I think about the English language, I'm talking about people like Lincoln, people like Martin Luther King. But there's a whole tradition, even women's rights. I mean, there's a whole tradition in which the expression of freedom that our founding documents give rise to, or at least express, at least for those in America, have been quite powerful. And it's a proxy of a particular culture with those democratic values that I think are expressed through the English language. So it's not necessarily just English, but I think English is a good proxy for what it represents regarding the values that we supposedly stand for, and the identities that we want to promote as opposed to the identities that we get with identity politics. So you're right about the prevalence of English around the world, but when it comes to America, I think an appreciation of English, speaking English correctly and appropriately, recognizing its origins, I think there's something about its symbolic value that might have the potential to be the basis, or at least one of the ingredients to a sense of consciousness, feeling proud of that heritage of going back all the way to Dred Scott, right, 1857, all the way to 2023, Students for Fair Admission. I mean, I think those democratic values and the evolution of the country through those court cases, how it's expressed, it is sort of a testament to the values that are sort of embodied by the English language. So again, the context regarding English that I'm referring to mainly is sort of in America, the evolution of our country culturally as expressed through the various individuals that have spoken most powerfully to that spirit of freedom and equality and color-blindness. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
I'm Rob Madelson. In your discussion of the Greek attitude toward character, everything that I've read confirms that it really was pretty colorblind. I mean, there seems to be very little, but very little racial prejudice in Greco-Roman literature. But that's not the only divide the Greeks had.
Right.
And what about the barbarians? The barbarians, as Aristotle said, barbarians are natural slaves.
Right.
And even more telling, what about women? The standards, obviously women were in an extremely subordinate position, especially in Athens. And the standards of virtue for men and women were very different. So how would you respond to someone who says the Greek tradition really is not helpful in this way? Maybe helpful in the area of race, but it's not helpful in the area of ethnicity, and it's toxic in the area of gender.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I would say that my argument, for the most part, does have to do with race and character. And as you say, I mean, Aristotle said a lot of things about women that are just off base. I agree with you. And this idea of natural slavery, it was language in particular that really made a distinction between the barbarians, the natural slaves, and the Athenian male Greeks. So I'm not saying the tradition necessarily, the specific tradition I'm appealing to is helpful when it comes to the relationship between men and women, or at least talking about the nature of women. But I do think there are some Greek writings, also in Aristotle and Plato, that speak to the potential of all human beings, including women. Plato, yeah. So you look at Plato's Republic. I mean, there's some passages in there that are quite progressive in terms of, well, given the time. But I do agree with you. I think that Aristotle essentializes. He does that for natural slaves, obviously. He does that for women. He does that for children. But children have the potential, or at least males, to become fully rational. So I do think it's a good critique. But it's helpful in the area that I want to focus on. But I think there are other traditions in the West that are also quite powerful at critiquing that aspect of Greek philosophy. And I think it should be talked about in the context of character I think we can do both. Yeah. Yes.
Hi there, I'm Dr. Arnold. I teach American government and American political thought here. Your talk was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And it brought to mind last semester when I taught American political thought, we spent a lot of time on Booker T. Washington.
Yep.
And I was thinking of him through your talk because he shared your interest in really cultivating the habits of virtue and character and an emphasis on classical. There's a kind of classical undertone in much of his thought, the common good, harmony between the races, and the purpose of life is happiness found through spiritual excellence. But Washington is also sometimes seen as the guy who really focuses only on the practical education as the real solution. And he's seen as abandoning maybe the focus on a philosophical education for Black Americans. And so I say that just by way of a question of today, how do we navigate the issue of, well, the young Black male, he might not be able to go to college. And so is what he needs that practical education that distills Christian virtue in him? Or should we really promote more higher education in the Black community that is along the great books line? And so I guess that, does that question?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I don't think we should have any sort of policy or any sort of specific orientation towards, a debate. I think that is passé. I think that the Black community is autonomous enough to decide what sort of education they want to pursue. I think Booker T. Washington was speaking to, it was a different time, and we were right after slavery. I mean, how should we educate freedmen and free women? And I think that debate was a lively debate. And so we have W.E.B. Du Bois, who compliments Booker T. Washington. But even with Frederick Douglass, Frederick Douglass recognized that people are born into different stations, right? There are those who will pursue the liberal arts. There are those who will pursue vocational education. I think that it's like that today. So I think the question is, are we giving everyone an opportunity to pursue their God-given talents, to exercise their God-given talents? Now, there are some cultural features for a number of groups, especially Black males that you talked about, that make it difficult to exercise or take advantage of the opportunities that are afforded to them. And we can talk about that, but I don't think we should have any race-conscious policies to specifically address that. I think we should address that as our fellow citizens, fellow human beings, who should be introduced to a set of values that might be helpful, a sense of upward mobility. But I think that we're all free to exercise our lives in such a way that we can make mistakes. We can engage in counterproductive behavior. I mean, we hope that's not the case. But I think sort of advocating for a particular type of education for a particular community is no longer needed. I just think in general we need to open up possibilities and opportunities for all communities. And perhaps focus on deficiencies that we find in certain communities, but not in terms of race, but just in terms of we want all human beings, all Americans to flourish. Yeah. So hopefully that helps.
It does. Yeah. And perhaps the great truths of the great books, they don't always have to be relayed through college. Right? They can come from your church, they can come from your neighborhood.
That's right.
Your mom and dad.
And it's more effective, in fact, at those levels. Family. I mean, the greatest inequality, we talk about wealth inequality. We love talking about that, not we, but in popular media. But, the greatest inequality is the family. And not having a family, not having the foundations to make it possible to flourish, to me, that's the greatest inequality. How do we fix that? Well, I have a number of suggestions, but I think the focus should be on that. Because I think that's where, the beginning is half the whole. The Greeks say that. The beginnings are half the whole. And so if your beginnings are compromised, and no one's family is perfect, it's going to make it that much more difficult. So I think that's where we need to focus as opposed to these race-conscious policies to address those issues. Yes?
I'm Kathleen Chandler. You mentioned can you recognize me in the law? That was one of your sentences. So how do we deal with all of these civil rights? Like here in Colorado, we have the Civil Rights Commission, and that was one of the things that it didn't have to do with race necessarily, but it was used in many of the cases here for the LGBTQ. So how do we kind of transcend recognition in the law and civil rights, the concept of that? Because in some respects, the new civil rights is really the takings of property, which have nothing to do with, I think, their intended beginning.
That's a difficult issue. I mean, I think that private property needs to be addressed, or at least the taking of private property. And when I say private property, I'm also including public property. So you have private individuals taking over public property. I'm thinking of, the homeless, but even in some cases, an infringement upon private property owned by individuals. But in terms of civil rights, if I'm understanding your question, are you saying that those civil rights is being used in order to infringe upon a person
Yes.
or a group's?
Yes, I think that that's been really prevalent, is that people see, you need to see me, therefore I am now above you because you didn't see me. And the law then gives me a special right, when in reality, the law should be colorblind.
That's right. So
The categories have metastasized.
Yeah,
So instead of just protecting a few categories of people with immutable characteristics, it now spreads across a wide range of characteristics,
LGBT,
including a lot of voluntary
it's like,
conduct.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm opposed to that. And I think that, I do think we're moving in that direction. Recognizing that we shouldn't have these subnational identities or these particular identities sort of inscribed in law. And I think with the recent Supreme Court decision, we're moving in that area. Specifically in Colorado, I'm not as familiar with the Civil Rights you said commission here, but are you talking about that in the context of like transgender rights and all of that?
Yes, the Civil Rights Commission here has I feel, overstepped its bounds, and it's now becoming this special rights grantor, and therefore it taking away other people's rights, because that's pretty much what they've done. And in reality, then the word civil right has nothing to do necessarily with its intended consequence, which was like, don't mess with Black people in their ability to flourish. And now it's being changed to, you must now give me something, because I'm thinking my rights are being violated by you, when in reality they're not.
Yeah, I think the best way to handle that is what we're starting to see is that, at the grassroots level, who do we vote for?
Yeah.
I mean, in Colorado, I think, one party has a supermajority. So there are many, I think, policies that are just antithetical to what we stand for as a country. And it's difficult to do anything here in Colorado. And it's like this in a lot of other places. But I think we have to get out there and vote. We have to continue to educate the way that you're educating. Because otherwise, you're right, sort of recognizing individual groups that are detrimental to what we stand for is becoming, I think it's becoming less prevalent, but we are seeing it in a way that we would see it at one time with race. I think that's starting to evolve a bit. But yeah, these other identities are starting to say, what about me? But I'm hopeful. I think it's on the decline. I mean, I would like to think that. But yeah, I too am opposed to those sorts of practices and that type of recognition.
I think it's a decline in the national, but in certain states, specifically here in Colorado and other states, I think it's actually almost on the rise, which is unfortunate. And so we're going to end up with these disparity, really laws, whereas you would go across state lines, you're going to be completely treated differently.
That's right. And what bothers me, and I was getting to this when I first answered you, is that, public spaces where we come together as citizens are being taken over, are being dominated by sort of bad actors. I mean, it's difficult to go places now, downtown, public library, with your family and feel safe, you know? And I think what that does, that sort of turns us in on ourselves, you know, we become sort of walled off in order to sort of keep that at bay. And I think by doing that, we're not as engaged.
Right.
And I think, you know, when people vote, you get a small group of people voting, and they're the loudest, and they gain power, you know. And if you look at the numbers and the amount of people who vote in our elections, at least in Colorado, it's very small.
Yeah.
And so you have the most radical, or at least I think radical people being elected. But it's not characteristic of the community as a whole, or at least I don't think so. But that's why we have to get people engaged in order to express what's normal.
Apathy.
It's happening, exactly.
So the attempt to maintain cohesion and unity upon creed, was that destined to fail, or was it just a failure to adhere to and maintain a fidelity to the creed? So Lincoln, I think it was July 9th, 1858, the elector court speech, he calls for a religious-like devotion to the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and a constant return to those over and over, instruction, adherence to. Was that impossible to maintain cohesion and unity?
I think it was. Looking back on it, I think it was because, you know, at the time, there was more uniformity, just in terms of the people, right? I think it wasn't nearly as diverse as we are today. I think they were less sentimental than we are, and so they stuck to a standard. It wasn't always a great standard, but you know, they had standards. I think today we're very romantic, we're very sentimental. I think that our sentimentalism is sort of misplaced in terms of we shouldn't celebrate the victim, but we should encourage them to, or individuals or groups to be more autonomous and self-regarding. So because we're so diverse today, and our values, our culture has changed, I think it was destined to fail because to say I'm an American, I believe in constitutionalism, equality, I mean, that really doesn't resonate. I mean, it resonates intellectually, and, you know, we can talk about it and celebrate that we're all equal. But when you feel alienated, you want an identity, right? You want to feel like, you know, there's something special about you as an African American, as Hispanic or Asian, or even a white American, right? We're starting to get that on the right. We talk about the woke right. But I think that idea of a white Christian identity, it's sort of the mirroring DEI. And I'm not saying those who are right of center think like this. I'm not sure how widespread it is, but you know, there's a growing group who feel this way. But I think even there's a sense of alienation among young white males that is pretty much equivalent to what you get in the Black community. So I think that we need something more culturally that speaks to us in a way that says, hey, we're Americans, and we have this noble tradition, we've come far, we haven't been perfect, but we have the ability to self-correct, we should celebrate that. But I think it needs to be some cultural practices, like I mentioned, English is a proxy for democratic values. But reading the greats, talking about what English has done in terms of making America better, sort of the relationship between the King James Bible and like the Civil Rights Movement, Lincoln, Frederick Douglass. To me, it's the language that sort of represents those sorts of movements. So I think it was inevitable that creedalism isn't, or at least that's my interpretation. Yes?
When speaking of this kind of current present identity of the United States, you mentioned kind of it's rooted in this desire for recognition. And you go on to speak about this cultural identity of America that is Anglo-Protestant, and part of one of the aspects of that you speak of as individualism. Is this desire for recognition an exaggeration of this Anglo-Protestant identity of individualism to an extent of individuality as kind of the essence of American culture, and how do we return? How do you correct that desire for recognition? Because I believe, as you stated, this return to American culture, return to this Anglo-Protestant culture and to the English language, as you're saying, gives incredible value and reunites the individual with the whole, but how do you correct that desire for recognition?
So I don't think that the politics of recognition, which basically grew out of multiculturalism, that's what multiculturalism was, is this politics of recognition. But it wasn't the recognition of the individual, it's the recognition of the group. And I think that's where identity politics becomes powerful, because it's the group that's demanding recognition. And because of our past, as I mentioned, I think it's easy to do that when it comes to African Americans and the struggle for civil rights. But I think that's been detrimental. And I think we've learned a lesson, or at least we have, I hope we have, given our recent history with DEI. But I said individualism, not excessive or expressive. So I think individualism is a core feature of America. But it presupposes that there are communities and communal values, religious precepts that undergird that individual, that undergirds this individualism. So it's not a rugged individualism. It's sort of couched in communities that speak to traditions, that animate us. So that's why, when you read the founders, education was so significant. Should the new nation educate for character, or should we set up government to incentivize right sorts of actions? That's always been a problematic or tension, the tension that defines us as Americans. And I think ultimately we decided on sort of cultural institutions providing incentives. So that's why it's so important not to recognize groups in law, because now you incentivize a certain behavior among groups. And when you have a society as diverse as ours, when you have that sort of competition, it's dangerous. It's like Rwanda, or potentially like Rwanda, or what happened. So we need to minimize group rights, this recognition of groups. I still think the individual and extolling the individual is important. But again, it has to be in the context of communities, religion, types of education. And that way it's not excessive or rugged type of individuals. Does that help? Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you so much.